Hi, everybody. I'm Peter Spendelow, and we're going to be talking today about the impact of food choices on the world environment. I wanted to give you a little bit of background about myself first, though. Came out of college and out of university specializing in biology and zoology, particularly evolutionary ecology. I've had my PhD in that field. But when I got out of school, I got interested in a bottle bill and recycling related issues. And that's where I ended up getting my job with the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. I've worked here at DEQ for 35 years now, since 1985. And I've been working in the section now we call it the materials management section. It used to be the solid waste and recycling section. But we figured out that materials really have much more impact on the environment, not at the end of life, not when you go to recycle them or throw them away or compost them or whatever else you might do it. Materials really have their impact at the beginning of life, when you cut down trees to make paper, or where you dig minerals out of the ground to make metals, or you pump oil out of the ground to make plastics. That is where the environmental damage happens. It's not so much at the end of life when you go to throw the stuff away. So we've been really concentrating on that, and I'm going to be talking a lot about that here, dealing with one of the most impactful materials we have, which is food. The other piece of background about me that you might be interested in is that for 10 years, I was the president of a nonprofit group called Northwest Veg that looks at trying to promote plant-based diets, trying to get people to eat lower on the food chain, and other sorts of reasons, like the way we treat our animals, and also health. And I just came last Saturday, I just was the planning committee coordinator for a health and nutrition conference that's made for professionals. So I have a lot of interest in this field. So let's get into the slides themselves, though. So let me just find my slideshow here, and hopefully everything will go okay here. Yeah, here we go. So this is what we're going to be talking about today. I want to first start out with how large is the impact that food has on the environment. And I want to concentrate on animal agriculture and talk about why it is that animal agriculture has a particularly outsized impact on the environment. Some of the types of impacts, unfortunately, I won't have time to cover many of these, but some of the types I'm going to concentrate on are particularly greenhouse gases, habitat impacts and habitat loss, a little bit on water. I won't be able to talk much on the oceans or air, or a lot of other things I'd love to talk on. But I also wanted to talk a little bit about the methods we use for determining what the impact is and how much impact certain things have compared to each other, so comparing commodities. And this is a method we call life cycle assessment. And again, my section at DEQ is really concentrating on this. So let's just think for a moment about what ways we can reduce the environmental impact of food, and also what ways are the most effective. Well, these are some of the sorts of things that people talk about, and I won't say too much about which is more important here. Hopefully you'll see that as we go through the talks, but I won't be able to get to all these sorts of things. But one of the things people talk about a lot is growing food locally. But then there's also issues of improving the management of food at end of life. I mentioned, for instance, you could compost food, or you could use anaerobic digestion, where you put the food into a closed container where oxygen can't get in. It forms methane as a byproduct, and also forms a material you can use as fertilizer, and the methane you can use as a fuel. We could improve the management of food before consumption, things like improving the transportation, the packaging, refrigeration, which is a pretty important thing, how you cook foods, how much cooking they need. So those are all things that we can be doing. And we can improve the methods of producing food, such as improving agricultural practices, such as organic agriculture, for example. And we can reduce the wasting of food. This is one thing I'll say a little bit about here, because one of my jobs at DEQ is I do our statewide waste composition study. We hire contractors to literally go out and sort garbage from garbage trucks and from drop boxes and from people self-hauling garbage. And we figure out what is being thrown away. And it's rather amazing to me to see that if you look at what's in your residential garbage cans here in the Portland metro area, 25% of that is food. That just seems like a lot to me. And I've heard from various studies that somewhere around 30 to 40% of the food that we produce in this nation ends up being thrown away without being eaten. So that's certainly something we could cut down on and reduce some impacts by doing that. And then we can change the type of foods we produce and consume. And that's the thing that I think we're going to be talking about a lot today. So let me give you first this, with some of the aspects about how important it is. This is a table showing the amount of land surface that's used in different ways. And if you look at this, you'll see that agriculture takes up 37.6% of all land. You also have forests taking up 30.7%, and barren areas like the Antarctic or the Sahara Desert, or parts of Australia and so on, taking up about 31%. So if you look at the productive areas, agriculture and forests, the bulk of it's agriculture. And if you look at the agriculture, you'll see the bulk of it is pasture. And even in the areas that's not pasture, the crops and temperate pasture areas, a lot of that's for animal agriculture too, because a lot of the crops we grow are grown to provide food for animals. So looking at this graphically, here's some slides out in National Geographic, and you can see the green areas are where most of the agriculture is cropland, and the brown areas where it's more pasture, and some areas which are sort of in between, it's partly crops and partly pasture. And if you look, for instance, at India, you see massive amounts of that's being used for agriculture. In the United States, you see the whole Mississippi Valley, for instance, is heavily used for agriculture. And then out here in the West, in the dry, arid areas, a lot of that more is being used for pasture. But even in the places where you're growing crops, again, what are you growing those crops for? And this next slide here shows what percentage of the food that is raised in these areas is being used for human consumption versus what percent is being used for what they call feed and fuel. Feed refers to animal feed. And if you look here at the United States again, you can see that it's really heavily weighted towards the animal food. That a lot of that productive area, what we're growing are crops for cattle or chickens or other types of animals, instead of growing food that we can eat ourselves. Whereas if you look at India as another example, in the United States, 73% is being used for non-human consumption. Only 27% there is being used for human consumption. Whereas in India, it's the exact opposite. Only 11% is being used for animal food and for fuel, and 89% is being used for human consumption. So really big differences there throughout the world as which is which. Now, another way I wanted to talk about what is the impact that agriculture has, or the humans have really on the environment, is to just tell you something that I think is really kind of fascinating. And that is the dominance of different species we have of mammals on the planet. What I'm going to ask you to think about is which species of all the animals in the world, which species has the most which species of mammal? I'm going to stick to just mammals. So I'm just talking about, dogs and cows and elephants and giraffes and whales and the other mammals, rabbits, mice. What species do you think, or group like that, has the highest amount of biomass in the world? And we're going to measure biomass in terms of the amount of carbon present. And so think about that for a moment. And if you came up with humans, well, you're close. Humans certainly have a huge amount of biomass there, with something like 55 million metric tons of carbon in all the humans throughout the world. Now let's think about all the wild mammals out there. So we're talking whales, giraffes, elephants, rhinos, hippos, mice, rabbits, squirrels, porcupines, woodchucks, all the different mammals that we have out there. How big is their biomass compared to the human biomass? And think about that. Is it twice as big, 3 times as big, 10 times as big? Is it equal to, maybe smaller than? Well, it just floors me when to find out that actually the biomass of all the wild mammals in the world is only about 1/10 of the biomass of humans. It just shows how much humans dominate. But as I said before at the beginning here, humans aren't the one with the most biomass. So think again, what type of animal do you think has the most biomass? It's certainly not any of the wild mammals. And I think maybe if you might be able to guess, it's cattle. And sure enough, cattle is the species that has the most biomass in the world, about 8 million metric tons. But cattle, of course, aren't the only non-wild mammal out there. We also have dogs and cats and sheep and goats and various other mammals too. And so think about those for a second. How much biomass are they? Well, they're pretty substantial too, another 40 million metric tons. So if you look at this, you add together the humans and the cattle and the other domesticated animals, basically animals that we control, that we have full control over their life. Wild mammals are only about 3% of the total biomass out there. It's just, we are just such a human-dominated ecosystem out here as far as mammals go. It's just really kind of flooring. So let's go to talk about some environmental issues right now. Again, my agency, the Department of Environmental Quality, deals with all these sorts of issues, global warming, habitat loss, water pollution. By the way, global warming, my section actually has some orders from the governor to try to take some actions to reduce global warming as far as food goes. And I'd love to talk about that more, but I don't have time to talk about it now. But all these things, energy conservation, water conservation, toxins, what's going on in the ocean, the ecological damage there, these are all important issues. And I want you to think a moment, when you think about environmental issues and humans causing that, what do you think of? What sort of things do you think humans do that cause a lot of environmental damage? I think if you ask most people this, they'll think about factories producing air pollution. They'll think about cars and planes and so on, creating carbon dioxide, which is causing global warming. A lot of people, right now, plastics are really hot. A lot of people are talking about reducing plastics. These are the sorts of things that people are talking about. But I want to point out that if you look at food, the production of food in particular, that has huge impacts on every single one of these environmental issues. I'll be talking a lot about its impact on global warming, but certainly I'll talk some about habitat loss, water pollution, air pollution. I mean, all these things, especially what's going on in the ocean. Our production of food is just hugely, hugely impactful. So what I want to do, though, before I get into this much, is I wanted to explain some of the basic biology, because I'm going to be showing you a lot of statistics through this, but you don't remember statistics. I think much more important is to understand the biology behind this all. And so I'm going to go back to some really stuff you probably learned very early on, back in high school or earlier, about basic food chain ecology. Now, it's not a food chain. It's not like everything's linear, that the top predator eats the secondary predator, and they eat the primary predator, and then they eat the herbivores, and the herbivores eat the grass. It's not like a straight line, because it's a kind of a net. That owl, for instance, could eat anywhere down the food chain, or even down to the insects. You have a lot of owls that eat insects. But I wanted to point out that all these animals don't produce anything fresh, that all of the only creatures that can take sunlight and carbon dioxide and water and turn it into things like proteins and fats and carbohydrates, sugars and starches and so on, the only things that can do that are plants and also some bacteria. Everything else harvests the energy that was produced lower on the food chain. But when they do that, when they harvest that energy, when the mice eats the corn, or when the snake eats the mouse, or so on, most of the energy that higher level creature carnivore gets, or the herbivore gets from the plants, most of the energy gets used up just in that animal's living. Keeping its body warm, running around, mating, doing all the things that they're doing. That's where most of the energy gets used up. Only about 10% of the energy goes into growth. And growth is the animal getting bigger, and it's also reproduction, the animal producing, eggs and watching them through to when they grow into adult animals. So you have about a 90% loss of every step along the chain here. And as a result, you have a very big reduction in the biomass that can be supported at each level. You might have only one owl in a square mile out here, whereas in that same square mile, you might have thousands or even tens of thousands of mice and rabbits and crickets and various other things that are lower down on the food chain. So just keep that in mind as we're going through here, that you get this huge energy loss as you go up the food chain. And let's talk about an animal which is very commonly consumed for food, cattle. They're actually a pretty low efficiency as a food animal. And let's look at some data here. This is a grazing animal. So this isn't something that's being corn-fed in a stall somewhere. This is an animal out grazing in dry lands. And let's start out with a calf that's been weaned. It's about 6 months old or so, weighs about 330 pounds, and is growing at a little more than half a pound a day. Well, growing a little more than half a pound a day, well, actually, before I get into that, it's eating, on average, you measure what it's eating about 7,200 calories a day. That's a lot more than I eat because, they're growing faster and they can get a lot bigger than I do. So they're eating about 7,200 calories a day, but it's growing at about half a pound a day. And how many calories is that equal to? Well, if all of it were meat, which of course it isn't because you have hair and bone and all sorts of other stuff in there besides meat, but if all of it were meat, that half a pound would work out to, or 0.55 pounds, works out to 635 calories you can get out of a food database. So what you're talking about is the animal's taking in 7,200 calories, it's getting out 635 calories. You're talking about 11 calories in for every calorie you get out, which is, obviously a lot of energy being wasted along there. And as it gets older, it gets worse because here 6 months later, if you look at this, now it's up to 550 pounds. It's needing to eat more because it's bigger. It's still growing at about half a pound a day. So now it's 15 calories in for every calorie you get out. And as it gets to full grown, well, what's full grown mean? It means that it's not growing anymore. And so the bull, for instance, a farmer wouldn't keep that around except for maybe to get the cows pregnant. There's no reason why it would keep it around otherwise, because all you're doing is feeding it. You're not getting any production of food out of it. And I'm that way too. If I were a farmed animal, I actually weigh less than 188 now. I produced this slide a while back, but so actually I'm being negative here, that I have negative growth, and a farmer wouldn't keep me around. But I'm showing this partly to point out that the reason why animals are slaughtered at such a young age usually is because that's when they're the most productive. And as they get older, you end up having to feed them more and you don't get as much out of them. So, I'm gonna just stop here and just ask you guys a question to think about for a moment. Chickens, there are two types of chickens. There are the egg-laying hens, and then there are what are called the broiler chickens. I mean, there are many, many different types, but this is how agriculture puts them into these two big groups. And think about the chickens that are being raised just to be slaughtered. How old do you think they are at age of slaughter? So, the egg gets laid, the egg hatches. Starting at the date the egg hatches, how old do you think the birds are on average when they are slaughtered? Are you thinking 6 months, 3 months? The answer is probably about 45 days is kind of an average, and it's been going down. It's just amazing how they bred these birds to grow so fast that it gets from just hatching out of the egg to being a full-grown bird in just 45 days. And actually, it's really kind of sad in a way because these birds have been bred to grow so fast that actually it probably couldn't live much longer than 45 days, because they just grow so fast, the bones can't keep up with it. And their circulatories can't keep up with it. They'll have heart attacks, they'll break bones. And if you keep these birds around, for instance, every year the president pardons a turkey. And the idea is, you have this turkey otherwise gone to slaughter, and now it's going to go off and live a beautiful life in a sanctuary somewhere. Well, most of those turkeys are dead by the next year because, again, these turkeys are bred to grow really fast and they just can't survive. Their bones will break. It's just really pitiful. So anyway, back to this. Let's talk about chickens and how they're more efficient. This is an egg-laying barn. Just amazing the efficiency here. A lot of it's the human efficiency, but you might have like 15,000 birds in this barn, and you have automatic watering and automatic feeding, and the eggs roll out. And by the way, in some cases, the way they clean up the poop is that the poop just falls down through from cage to cage and ends up in the bottom, and then to scrape it out then. More modern ones have belts to take that away too. But it's really amazing the efficiency here. Small housing, they eat a lot of plant-based foods, high density, not much heating and lighting going on there. If you look at this, I think I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 combs in there. There might be more, but this is 6 birds living out their entire life in something which is not much larger than a large microwave. And they're so packed in there that you can see there's 2 birds standing one on top of another because there just isn't the floor space for them to be there. And again, chickens, I don't know if, people think chickens are dumb, but they're actually very intelligent animals. They have about 30 different calls that they use to communicate different things with them. They're very social. They're pretty smart animals. And, for them to live their whole life this way, it's really kind of something. It's hard to think about what it would be like to live in this condition. You're put in there as soon as you're old enough to lay eggs, and that's your whole life, is sitting in that little cage with your cellmates there, so to speak. So broiler chickens, really, really efficient from a biological standpoint. Instead of 10 calories in for every calorie you get out, it's only like about 3 or 4 calories in for every calorie you get out. Because again, these have been bred to grow really, really fast. And the faster you grow, the more efficient it is. Hogs, they're also been bred to grow really fat and really big quickly. They're not quite as efficient as chickens, so it's more like about 5 calories in for every calorie you get out. And eggs, it's probably about 5 or maybe a little bit less than that also. So, again, this is really high efficiency compared to the natural world out there. But a lot of that is because we bred these animals to be that way. And also we restrict their movements so they're not moving around and using up a much of energy in other ways too. So, okay, so that's the basic biology I wanted to go over, and some stuff about individual food animals. Let's talk a little bit about global warming. And actually, this will be a little bit of biology too. Up until 2006, there were people who knew how important food was as far as global warming goes, but didn't really hit the general public until the publishing by the United States Food and Agriculture Organization of this monster study called Livestock's Long Shadow. Now, this is a document about 400 pages, just loaded with tables and graphs and lots of information. It's a massive amount of work. But I wanted to read to you some of the statements in the executive summary of this. The livestock sector is by far the single largest anthropogenic user of land. Anthropogenic means human-related. In all, livestock production accounts for 70% of all agricultural land and 30% of the land surface of the planet. That's this next statement, I think, which really shocked people. Regarding greenhouse gases, the livestock sector is a major player responsible for 18% of the greenhouse gases as measured in CO2 equivalents and carbon dioxide equivalents. This is a higher share than transport. What are they saying there? They're saying is that the greenhouse gases that livestock sector alone, not all agriculture, just the livestock sector, is higher than all of the cars, trains, boats, planes, the things that we think of when we think of, what's the greenhouse gas problem. Now, in the United States, it actually is not true because our animals are a bit more efficient here, but the main thing is we do a heck of a lot more transportation. So in the United States, transport is a higher thing. But if you look at a worldwide basis, I think they peg the transportation share out at about 12 or 13%. And by the way, this was published in 2006. Since then, the Food and Agriculture Organization has updated the numbers. So it's dropped a little bit. I think it's about 14.5% now that they come up with instead of 18%. But still, it's still higher than transport. It's still a huge amount. If we're going to do something about the greenhouse gas problems, we can't avoid dealing with the livestock sector, because that is just a huge amount of greenhouse gas being pumped out from that sector every year. So what is causing this? Again, getting into the biology of this, well, there are things like there's just straight energy use. We know that you have to run tractors around and move hay and stuff like that. So you've carbon dioxide produced from that. But the FAO report, Livestock's Long Shadow, found that of these 4 factors, that was the least important. Much more important was a gas called methane. Methane, that's a very simple, it's 1 carbon and 4 hydrogens. Maybe know something about that in chemistry. It's a potent greenhouse gas. 1 molecule of methane is equivalent of 30 molecules of carbon dioxide on the 100-year time scale. And if you're more worried about what's happening in the near future, it's more like about 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide on a 20-year time scale. So methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. And how does animal agriculture get involved in that? Well, cows can do something that we can't, but they don't do it directly. They can digest grass, they can digest cellulose. We don't do a good job of digesting cellulose. Maybe a tiny, tiny bit can be digested, but most of it just comes out of us. That's fiber going through us. But what cows do is they don't digest it directly themselves. Instead, they have this section of their stomach right up in front, the very first section, called the rumen. And so they'll eat a lot of grass and they'll pack this rumen full of grass. And then there are bacteria in there. And of course, being in the middle of a cow's stomach, there's not much oxygen in there. You don't have blood vessels going into the stomach to feed the contents of that stomach. So it goes anaerobic, it goes without oxygen. But these bacteria that live there are primed to live in anaerobic conditions. So they can take the cellulose and digest it, and they produce a byproduct. That byproduct is methane. And the cow belches it out. So it comes out the front of the cow, not the back, like a lot of people think. But anyway, that methane is produced. And I've heard that as much as like 8% of the energy going to a cow might come out in the form of methane. So that's a potent greenhouse gas. It's a big issue. Fertilizer, though, is another big issue. Nitrous oxide is a very potent greenhouse gas. It's on the order of 300 times more potent than carbon dioxide is. And how does this deal with animal agriculture? Well, a lot of the foods that we feed to animals, chickens and cows and so on, is grains and other things that we grow in crops. And to do that, we fertilize these crops. A whole lot of nitrogen is used in the production of corn that is just going to go to feed cattle. And when you put that nitrogen fertilizer on the ground, it decomposes over time, and a bunch of it gets released as nitrous oxide. And I've heard that that's somewhere on the order of like 7% of the total greenhouse gas forcing is coming from nitrous oxide, and much of that nitrous oxide is coming from fertilizer, coming both from animal agriculture, the crops used there, and also the agriculture of that we have for our own direct use. But again, a lot of our croplands being used for growing animal food. But the biggest factor that the Food and Agriculture Organization found was what's going on in the tropics. Because as I'll show you in a little bit here, you've seen extensive cutting down of trees in the tropics in order to create more land, mostly to use for cattle ranching or for growing crops, and many of those crops again being used to feed to cattle or to feed to other livestock or to chickens. And so you have, when you cut down trees, you end up very quickly releasing all the carbon that's stored in those trees. You might burn the slash, for instance, but even if you don't, it's going to, if it was still in the tree, it would remain there for a long time. But you cut it down, it's going to decompose very quickly in a tropical habitat. Plus, also, you lose a lot of the carbon that's in the soil, because now you're exposing the soil to sunlight and wind and other things that can speed up the decomposition, and you lose the carbon in the soil. And that is what the Food and Agriculture Organization found was actually of these 4 different factors was the largest one. So I want to talk a little bit about habitat here. My son went to graduate school in Champaign-Urbana, which is the heart of the agricultural area. And if you go out there and look around, you'll see this. You'll see fields of corn, massive amounts of corn, that's in the background there. And in the front, you see fields of soybeans, and you get these huge, huge monocrops being just one species of crop growing in these areas. And you ask yourself, what are we growing this for? Has anybody ever had the corn growing out of the fields in these Midwest areas? You don't want to eat it. It really tastes awful because it's very, very starchy. It doesn't have any sweetness to it. But it's being grown because that starchy stuff and the protein and so on in there is mainly going to be used for animal food. Yes, we might get some high fructose corn syrup out of it or a bit of that sort of thing. But again, they're growing it mainly for animal food. And that's true for the soybeans too, grown mainly for animal food. We might get soybean oil out of it. And of course, there is a bunch of soybeans where we eat directly too. But a massive amount of soy is grown, again, for animal food. And it's a very high protein source. But, again, we go down to the tropics, and that's where you really see the issues. You see the clearing of land for making pasture, and the false color picture on the right shows the inroads being made into the Amazon as as the area for grazing or growing crops has increased. Um, and this slide coming out of a company called, or a nonprofit group called Mongabay. By the way, Mongabay is an excellent source of information for all things related to the environment, particularly in the tropical and semi-tropical areas. And they have published here the amount of deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon going back here to 1988. And they use very scientific information. This is official government figures. And you will see that, again, this is a metric. So the height of this shows about 15,000 square kilometers being deforested. It works out to about 6,000 square miles roughly, all the way through about to 2007, 2008 or so. And then it did drop off because Brazil started taking action to limit that. And unfortunately, I don't show the last couple of years here, but unfortunately, it started heading right back up towards where it used to be, because unfortunately, Brazil elected a new president who doesn't believe this is a problem, or believes that it's not a problem he wants to worry about. And what we've seen is that you heard about last year a whole lot of fires in the Amazon. Well, we're seeing them starting up again this year. And these are not fires set by lightning or natural things. A lot of these fires are human set. Illegally in many cases, but they want to clear land so again they can grow crops or raise animals on that land. So now think of that. If we were having about 6,000 square miles back in that decade around 2000 or so, being deforested every year, and what was that being used for? Most of it was being used for cattle ranching. The study estimated about 65 to 70% of the land cleared in the Brazilian Amazon was going to cattle ranching. You had small-scale agriculture accounting for another 20 to 25%. You had large-scale agriculture being somewhere around 5 to 10%. And again, a lot of that's being used for growing animal food. So that is it's not that they're logging for the trees and because the lumber and they're going to replant trees. It's mainly that they're logging, they're cutting down the forest in order to create more agricultural land and releasing a lot of carbon dioxide in the process. Well, if you take that amount, the average of the deforestation from 1998 through 2008, and then multiply it by 65%, assuming that about 65% is being used for cattle ranching, that works out to 4,424 square miles each year. And how big is that? Well, this pink area shows you. If you were to plop it down in Oregon, it would pick up the entire Willamette Valley all the way from Portland down to Corvallis. That much land was being lost to just the cattle industry from the lungs of our world, the Brazilian Amazon. Really, really scary. But what's it like here in Oregon? Is the animal agriculture such a big thing here? I mean, if you go around, you might not think it's much big at all. You will see some fields with cattle looking out there, grazing peacefully. You won't see, by the way, a lot of other agriculture. You won't see a lot of chickens or hogs and so on. A lot of these animals are kept in barns or cages where you just don't see them. Not so much here in Oregon, but especially in the Midwest and so on. You'll see these huge structures that might have 10 or 15,000 animals in them, just huge, huge operations. We've had some big ones here in Oregon too. But what you do see though, if you've seen a lot of the irrigation out there in Eastern Oregon, what are they irrigating for? Well, there are crops being grown out there, but a lot of it is irrigating to produce hay. And then you see other sorts of things like the killing of the predators, the killing of the competitors, the animals that might eat the same food that the cows are eating, or the predators that might prey on them. That is a huge amount of damage going out there. And if you think again that that's being used for human consumption, what is the crop which is the largest amount of acreage devoted to here in Oregon? It's hay. That's the largest. If you go to Oregon Agripedia and look at the numbers, you'll see that hay is more than wheat, for instance, and it's more than all the other grains together. It's fruits and vegetables are a pretty small amount there. Grass seed takes up more area than the fruits and vegetables. We're a big grass seed producing state. So again, here in Oregon, still, you have a massive amount of our habitat is being used related to animals, a lot of grazing. But then I wanted to point out some slides here that George Werthner provided. He's an excellent range biologist. And he was pointing out to me, if you look at the slide on the left here, you think, boy, that really looks beautiful. It looks like a calm area, completely untouched by humans. And actually, he'll look at that and say, no, that is something which shows a huge amount of ecological damage. He said, what's the damage there? Well, the damage is that cattle love the nice lush vegetation that grows along a stream side. And so come down there, they'll get water, they might wade in there, but they'll end up trampling down the bank. So what you have is, instead of a deep, narrow channel, you have a very shallow, broad channel. And so that's what you're seeing here is, and why is that bad? Well, it's bad because what do fish don't like hot water. And when you have a broad, shallow channel that's moving slowly there, during this, when the sun's pouring on it, that's going to really heat up, and that's going to pour into the other tributaries, and you're going to end up with hot water, and salmon do not like hot water. But look, if you just turn around in this place and look the other way, you'll see a fence. On the other side, that fence is keeping cattle out. And look what happens to the stream right on the other side of the fence. Instead of being this broad, shallow thing, it's a very narrow thing with not much exposure to the sun, a lot of vegetation growing up over it, shading it. And go a little bit further, and you won't even see the stream as you get a little bit further up, because again, it's been protected. It's very shallow, not shallow, it's very deep, it's narrow, and the vegetation going up shades it. And that is really good. So, George points to that first stream, which looks so beautiful, and says, no, that's a really damaged thing. And then, of course, you have another problem with where you have drier areas, and the cattle get in there, and if they get too far, you can lead to forming deserts. The slide on the right is a kind of a standard slide. You look on the left side of it is where the cattle are excluded, and although this is a very dry area, you can see there's vegetation throughout there. You see grasses and sedges and various things there. You look over on the right side, you see a lot of rock. You don't see hardly any vegetation at all, because the cattle have really stripped it. And even the trees there, you can see they don't have any vegetation until you get up about 6 or 8 feet, because again, the cattle have pretty much stripped everything there. So again, we got a lot of damage here. Talking about water, this is a slide dealing with California. California had huge droughts a few years ago, and everybody was blaming all the almond trees as taking up huge amounts of water. But if you look at this graph and what the different water uses are, the ones in color there, orange and yellow, are animal related. The largest user of water in California crops was alfalfa. How much do you guys eat alfalfa? I don't think so. So, and then the other forages, the other types of plants that they eat. And then if you even look at the crop things like corn and grain, a significant amount of that is again being used for animal food. So the water is associated not with our producing corn for our consumption, it's associated with producing corn for cattle or chicken consumption. Just briefly on water pollution, when people think of water pollution, they think of this sort of thing where you have a manure spill out of a factory farm and it kills all the fish downstream. And you might think of pesticides and fertilizers that are used for growing animal food, I should say. That's actually where most of the damage is coming from, what we call the non-point source pollution. All the fertilizer we put out there to grow crops doesn't stay there. It moves off eventually. Some of it's taken up by the plant, but some of it washes in the water. I wanted to just spend a little bit of time on this slide. This slide shows the Mississippi River Basin, and the areas in red are areas where more than 50% of the crops are being used not for human food, but for animal food. And you can see the highly productive areas of Iowa and Illinois and Indiana and so on, just huge amounts of that area being used for animal food. Then if you look in at the end of the Mississippi River, down in the Gulf there, you'll see a pink area, or kind of a purplish area. That area is the area of the maximum zone in 1999 of what they call the hypoxic zone. Hypoxic, what that means is areas that have very little oxygen. so little oxygen that fish and crabs and other animals can't survive there. And so that means they either have to move or they die. Well, look at the size of that area. That's, huge. That's bigger than the state of Connecticut, Connecticut and Rhode Island. And that was a big one in 1999, but we had an even bigger one just a couple of years ago down there. And this happens every single year. So what is causing this to happen? Well, the theory is that it's all these nutrients that we spread into the, all the nitrogen and the phosphorus and so on that we use for fertilizer, that when that washes into the rivers, that ends up feeding a lot of bacteria, and you have silt and so on. You have a lot of bacterial action going on, and as that goes into the Gulf, these bacteria are using up all the oxygen in the water, and that's what causes the hypoxic zone. At least that's the theory behind this. And that, this is just one hypoxic zone. There are hypoxic zones all along different parts of the coast, but this is the biggest one and happens again year after year. And I think you can tie that back, at least partly, to animal agriculture, since animal agriculture is what we're growing these crops for in these areas. And then I really wish I had more time to talk about the ocean, but I'll just talk about this one slide here. This shows a menhaden fishery. The menhaden is the type of fish that it's caught by the millions. It used to be used simply for fertilizer. How many of you ever eaten menhaden or heard of that being in the restaurant? I'm imagining none of you did, because now what we use this for is, it's called a reduction fishery. They pump these out, the fish basically suffocate up on the deck. That pipe in the back is the one pumping them out of the net. And then we don't eat them. Instead, we dry them, produce fish meal out of it. What are we using the fish meal for? We're using it to feed cattle, we're using it to feed chickens, and a lot of it is being used to feed fish, because we have all these large aquaculture areas where we're growing fish in pens under really stinky conditions in many cases. And you got to feed them something. So that's what these fish are going to be used for, is simply feeding other fish. Again, the waste there is just amazing in terms of the amount you have to, fish and pull out of the ocean in order to feed the fish that we have there, because you get the same sort of, inefficiency, so many calories in to just get a few calories out. There are a heck of a lot more calories in these fish here than will be added to the fish we're going to feed them to as fish meal. We won't get so many calories out of that. So I'm running up against the end of my time here, but I just wanted to quickly, actually I'm going to have to skip through this, and just wanted to talk about life cycle assessment, because a lot of the work we do for evaluating these things is based on a tool that I'm hoping some of you will learn about and use, called life cycle assessment. What life cycle assessment does is it's a way to figure out what the impacts are of different types of products or different types of activities. And what you do is you compile all the information on the, what it takes to produce that thing. You take an inventory, and you have, what are the inputs you're putting in, what's coming out that might cause damage, and then you look at, when you add these things up, what is the potential environmental impact that has throughout its life cycle. And so anyway, the life cycle is going all the way from extracting, things, growing crops, for instance, or, growing trees, cutting them down, manufacturing and processing them into the food we eat, transporting it, taking it to the store. In the store, we go in there and then we buy it, and then we have all the peels and the stuff we don't eat, and we get rid of it. That is the life cycle of food, as one example. And life cycle assessment looks at either part of that or all of that. And our agency did a life cycle assessment on food, looking at different types of food. What we were really looking at was to try to figure out how much of the impact, in this case, we're talking about greenhouse gas production, how much of the impact comes from the production of food in the first place, the growing of the food, how much comes from the processing of the food, when you take it to the food processor and they're going to, make your frozen peas or make your meals in a box or whatever you're going to make in the cereal that you're going to eat, how much comes, energy and is greenhouse gases produced by that. And then how much is produced in the packaging you're going to use when you take it to the retail store. And I think you can see from this graph that the bulk of the impact is in the production and very little of it's in the packaging or the processing, particularly for the animal foods. When you get into beverages, there is a fair amount of packaging there, but because there isn't a whole lot of energy used, greenhouse gas produced in the making of beverages like colas, because they're basically just water. But when you get into the meats and so on, that's high. But take a look at the size of these bars, and you can see something, I think, pretty clear. Beverages, pretty low. Cereals and grains, which is where we get most of our calories, also pretty low. Dairy, ooh, that's looking pretty high. Fish and seafood, ooh, that's pretty high too. Fruit, oh boy, that's really low. And legumes and nuts, that's pretty low too. And legumes nuts have a lot of calories, a lot of protein. If you do it on a calorie basis, they're even lower. Meat, ooh, that is really high. And then vegetables, they're pretty low too. And there have been many life cycle assessments done. One done back a number of years ago was done by a scientist right here in Beaverton, Oregon. And he produced this graph out of the data that they produced, the Environmental Working Group. He was the scientist behind it. And if you look again at this, it's breaking up stuff into production, which is the green, and the everything afterwards, which includes the retail, the transportation, processing, retail, and even cooking it and disposing of the waste. And if you look at what's over on the left-hand side there, you'll see lamb and beef and cheese and pork and farmed salmon, turkey, chicken, canned tuna, eggs. And then you drop down quite a bit and you see potatoes and rice and peanut butter and nuts. And then you have a few animal products over on the right, but they're, because this is being done based on kilogram, a lot of these products are things which are mainly water. So yogurt, for instance, and especially milk, is mainly water. If you look at this on a calorie basis, those jump right over there next to chicken as far as their height goes. But on these tomatoes and lentils and so on, very low. So the animal stuff is all high, the vegetable stuff is all low. Now, some people will look at this graph and say, oh, we really should be cutting back on our lamb and beef. And so we're going to move to chicken. Or we're going to do more with eggs. And I want to say that that's not the message I'd like you to get out of this, because I want to look at this from a different angle. And that is how many animals you have to kill to produce food. And there are animals killed even for producing vegetables and fruits and grains. You run over animals with tractors when you're out there. There's the direct slaughter, which is in red here, and then what's called harvest, which is the animals that are produced are killed indirectly through things like the agricultural products. And if you look at this, it's how many animals are killed produce 1 million calories. 1 million calories, by the way, is about the amount of calories that you eat in a year. And so if all you did was eat chicken, you'd be responsible for killing 250 birds a year. Whereas if you ate beef, you'd only be responsible for killing about 30. But one thing that I think really surprises people looking at eggs, you don't kill chickens to eat eggs. Why is that slaughter so high? Well, stop and think about it. How many eggs do chickens produce over the course of a year? They only produce about, they produce maybe 200 or so, and they only live about 1.5 years. And so, how many calories are in those 200 eggs? Besides that, think of all the male chickens, because, they don't keep male chickens around when they, male chickens, they don't keep the males egg-laying chickens around. They don't grow fast enough. When they sex these birds and they pull out all the females to put into those little cages we saw for egg laying, the males go directly into a garbage bag or into a grinder. They're just slaughtered immediately. Not much of a life for them, a few hours maybe. So I'm going to end there. I'm going to say, come back to what we had at the beginning. What are the ways we can do some environmental impacts? I haven't really had time to talk much about the first 4 here, and I talked a little bit about the 5th, but it's the 4th and the 5th thing, which are by far more important than the others. And I hope to be able to have a chance to talk to you about some of these other factors when we have our discussion, but they'll have to wait. And for now, let me stop sharing here and say goodbye to everybody. So thank you so much.